Hello everyone, I'm Katy Hessel and I'd like to welcome you to this special event which is part of the Sotheby's Talk series organised in partnership with Intelligence Squared. Today we are going to discuss the work of Carl Fabergé, one of the world's most celebrated jewellery designers, and examine how his legacy continues to inspire jewellery designers today. Founded in 1842 by Gustave Fabergé, Carl's father, the House of Fabergé began as a relatively small-scale jewellery business based in St. Petersburg. Carl's ambition and taste, however, would transform it to the point where he became the official goldsmith to the Russian Imperial Court. Most of us are familiar with the lavish and ingenious imperial presentation eggs, which were initially commissioned by the Tsar Alexander III of Russia on an annual basis as gifts to his wife, the Empress Maria Feodorovna. Designed to arouse a sense of wonder in the receiver, Fabergé's success lay in his ability to transform his clients' fantasies into reality, starting with an initial idea and understanding which material had best potential to transform the object into reality. In 1917, the Russian Revolution brought an abrupt and tragic end to the Romanov dynasty and also to the House of Fabergé. The family was forced out of the city and left behind 50 Imperial Fabergé eggs created between 1885 and 1916. We will all soon have the opportunity to see Fabergé's incredible creativity and craftsmanship up close when the Victoria and Albert Museum opens its doors next week to the exhibition Fabergé in London, Romance and Revolution. Joining me to discuss this fascinating topic, I am delighted to have with me three brilliant speakers with whom I'm sure I'm going to have a brilliant conversation. First of all, we have Solange Azagury-Partridge, British designer known for her jewellery and interiors. Her jewellery is featured in the permanent collections of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, as well as Les Arts Décoratifs in the Louvre Museum in Paris. Welcome, Solange.
Hello, thank you for having me today.
And Helen Culver-Smith, Sotheby's International Head of Russian Department, where she is responsible for valuing and sourcing Fabergé and Russian works of art for sale internationally. She works closely with collectors of Russian porcelain, silver, bronzes, enamels, Fabergé and objects of virtue to bring these important objects to the market. Welcome, Helen.
Hi, great to be here.
And Toby Faber, publisher and author of several books, including Fabergé's Eggs, the extraordinary story of the masterpieces that outlived an empire. He lectures widely and regularly on this fascinating subject. Hello, Toby.
Hello, lovely to be here.
So I would love to kick off by asking you all how you were introduced to the world of Fabergé and what was the first piece that you came across. Solange, I'd love to start with you.
Well, obviously Fabergé is very well known for their eggs, but I think the object that really fascinated me and showed me the skill and craft and ideas and poetry of Fabergé were the beautiful flowers, the fantastic little vases with a rock crystal water holding a stem of a flower, and I just thought how wonderful to have a permanent little posy on your desk or on your mantelpiece to look at and marvel and wonder at.
How about you, Toby?
Well, in my case, actually, it was another V&A exhibition. There was a famous one back in 1977 to mark the Queen's Silver Jubilee, at which something over 20 of the eggs were there. And I didn't go to the exhibition myself, I was only quite young, but I remember seeing them appear on Blue Peter, the children's television series, and being just impressed by them even then, actually, for being both the sort of, these objects from a vanished past, but also quite good fun.
Absolutely. And Helen, what about you?
For me, Fabergé actually took me by surprise. And much like Solange, it was the flowers. When I first moved to London, I was doing my master's in the history of dress. So I went to the Royal Collection mainly to look at a portrait, and all of a sudden came upon an entire wall of the flower studies that are housed in that collection and was completely mesmerized. I, of course, knew about the eggs, but had no idea of the range of things that Fabergé created and the imagination, like the scale of the imagination. So Fabergé kind of found me, I think.
Absolutely. Those eggs are so intricate. The flowers are so intricate. So let's take a step back and hear about where it all began. Toby, could you tell us the historic context in which Fabergé rose to fame and what triggered its incredible success initially?
Well, you've got the Romanovs themselves, of course, who had ruled Russia since 1613, massively wealthy in their own right, huge estates all the way across Russia, including all the way into Siberia, where, of course, the empire had expanded in the course of the 19th century. Autocrats of Russia. I mean, essentially, at one level, they owned the whole of Russia. And then Fabergé, the family had been Huguenots. They had fled France following the repeal of the Edict of Nantes in the late 17th century and moved gradually eastwards. They weren't called Fabergé then. They had Fabry or Favry. And it was Carl's father, Gustav, as you've mentioned, who I think probably adopted the name Fabergé, either him or his father, probably to stress their French connections, really, and started this jewelry shop in St. Petersburg. Took Carl then to Dresden for his education. In fact, Gustav seems to have retired to Dresden in order to achieve that, giving Carl an overall exposure to some of the great European jewelers. And then Carl returns to St. Petersburg to take over the family business, which has been left in the control of workmasters up till then, and really sets about transforming it. Firstly, really, by starting to build its connections with the imperial family. And he does that by volunteering to help at the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, where they're starting to deal with some of the great artifacts that have been discovered from the Scythian Empire, archaeological digs. And he offers to help clean them and catalogue them and restore those. And that starts to give him an in. And in fact, the first piece of jewelry that he sells to the Russian royal family is a pair of cufflinks that's based on those Scythian designs. And I think that was in the early 1880s. And then that obviously starts to give him an in. And he gets this commission in 1885 for what turns out to be the first Fabergé egg for the Empress Maria Feodorovna, who is given it as an Easter present from her husband, Tsar Alexander III. A loving couple who is quite clear what he wants to achieve with that egg. He wants to give her something that's going to amuse her. And we know this because there's a great exchange of correspondence between the Tsar and his brother about the egg, his brother has gone to collect it for the Tsar from Fabergé's shop in St. Petersburg. And he explains to the Tsar how it's going to work. And the Tsar replies to his brother, "Thank you, my dear Vladimir, for going to all this trouble on my behalf. I do hope the egg has the desired effect on its recipient." And why would this egg amuse the Empress Maria Feodorovna? When you see what it is, it's a doesn't look like a terribly exciting white enameled egg. It's about the size and appearance of a large duck egg. It's only when you look at that band around its middle, you think there might be something slightly more exciting to it. And indeed, it does open to reveal inside this golden yolk. And inside that golden yolk, this wonderful golden hen. And indeed, that golden hen opens to reveal a diamond miniature of the imperial crown. And inside that, a tiny ruby pendant, although those last two objects have actually been lost. So it's like a Matryoshka doll, isn't it? Like one of these Russian Matryoshka dolls, except it's also inspired by an egg in the Danish royal collection that Maria Feodorovna would have known growing up as a Danish princess. And it clearly worked. It clearly succeeded in amusing her, because it started this tradition that every year the Tsar would give his wife an Easter present from Fabergé. It's a tradition that just carries on. And it carries on, of course, even after the Tsar's death, when his son, Nicholas, becomes the last Tsar. Russia was a place that was hidebound in tradition. Nicholas wasn't going to stop giving an egg each year to his mother, but he's now got a wife as well of his own to give eggs to, Alexandra Feodorovna. And we start seeing some of the most magnificent eggs made for her as well. So, for example, in 1897, we get the coronation egg made for Alexandra, which is undoubtedly one of the most magnificent of the lot. I mean, you can see that wonderful guilloche starbursts underneath the enamel there of the egg itself. And then that diamond miniature of the Imperial Coach. It took a 22-year-old jeweler 18 months work to produce that Imperial Coach. He had to be that young because he had to have eyesight good enough to work at that level of miniaturization. And if you see that coach in the flesh, and I think people get the chance to at the V&A, you can, even without feeling it, you can almost sort of feel the springiness of its suspension. Such a wonderful piece of miniaturization, actually, that coach. And a lot of the eggs, in fact, for Alexandra Feodorovna do tend to memorialize some of what Fabergé at least saw at the great events of her husband's reign. So another example, for example, is this fabulous one, the Trans-Siberian Railway Egg, 1900, which was the year that the Trans-Siberian Railway was declared open. A great engineering achievement. It had been conceived to kickstart the industrialization of Russia, and it succeeded. In 1900, Russia had the fastest growing economy in Europe. And so a suitable event to commemorate in the egg. This is one of the bigger ones, by the way. It's about 6 inches higher, I suppose. And you can see what was the surprise inside that egg. The surprise being this wonderful golden coach. And this was part of the point about all of these eggs. Of course, they all had to have some sort of surprise in them that would lead to them, that would, I suppose, amuse the Empress. And is that golden coach amusing? I think it rather is, especially when you see that golden key attached to it, because that, of course, does the job you might think it is. It's a wonderful piece of clockwork, quite apart from anything else. So you've got the golden train inside the egg. It divides into sections and fits inside the egg. And then around the outside of that egg, you've got a map of the railway going from Russia from west to east. Just a fabulous commemoration of that achievement. And the last one I'm going to show you now is almost, well, it's one of the last ones produced, 1914, given again to Alexandra. This egg is called the Mosaic Egg because that's what it is. It's a lattice work of platinum with all these precious and semi-precious stones set into it to create this wonderful effect. The designer who designed it was actually inspired by seeing her mother-in-law work on a piece of needlepoint. And that is, of course, the look you get from that egg. And there again, you can see that wonderful surprise that sits inside it. On the other side of that frame there's a cameo portrait of the Russian, of the imperial children. And I just think it's worth pausing for a moment here, because here we are, we're almost 30 years now after that first egg back in 1885. Very quick canter through them. You've seen designs really grow and develop in the course of that period. And you've seen the creativity just carry on. Fabergé, every year, he's trying to produce an egg that's different from any previous year's egg. And this forces the most wonderful creativity. So while it's absolutely true, as people often say, that these are playthings of a decadent court, the kind of thing you could only get from a country that's ripe for revolution. And I think all of that is true. What is also absolutely true is that they're just the most wonderful examples of creativity. And you see that creativity growing from year to year, as well as the amazing quality with which they're made. So I think they really are an inspiration, these eggs.
Absolutely, it's utterly remarkable, and I love the unexpectedness of them as well. But Helen, I'd love to turn to you. It's probably fair to say that Fabergé took jewellery as a high art object to a completely new level. There are obviously the well-known Fabergé eggs, but there are also many other jewellery objects from the house of Fabergé. Could you set the scene for us?
Yes, absolutely. So I think Toby's done a fantastic job of setting the historical context for Fabergé. For me, I often think, what made Fabergé Fabergé? Why is it a name that still resonates with us? And Fabergé was the greatest of jeweler in the age of great jewelers. He was more prolific and more highly sought after than even the likes of Boucheron and Cartier. And why, again, was that? And it was because he was able to meet the demands of very important patrons, the royal family, the imperial family, with the technical limitations of the materials he was using. And again, Toby's shown us the Mosaic Egg, which is bar none my favorite egg. Being a needle pointer in my spare time, I think when I first saw this egg, all my worlds had aligned perfectly. But if you look at this egg, it's extraordinary. It is comprised of a mosaic of very tiny, tiny semi-precious stones. So, if we were to add up the material value of this egg, it is not vast. It is probably a couple of hundred pounds. But the way that these stones have been set within a framework, the innovation of it, the idea of bringing to life another form of decorative arts and really making it the most opulent, sumptuous object. This is also a cage work that, again, is on the round. And Fabergé, Toby has shown us in other examples, also innovated enameling on the round, a very difficult technique. You can imagine enamel is glass. It's incredibly friable. You have to fire it repeatedly. And Fabergé did this not only very technically well, but also so imaginatively. He innovated over 200 different shades of guilloché enamel. So he was looking at French examples, which he would see in the Hermitage. As Toby mentioned, he was restoring objects and was looking back to this past tradition of the decorative arts, but thinking, always thinking, what can I do to move it forward? What can I do to make it different? Really, what can I do to absolutely delight my patron? And here you see in this palette all the different guilloché patterns. You see some polka dots. I mean, anything from a whimsical polka dot to a beautiful wave, which when it catches the light, gives these objects the ability to kind of glow with their own light. Absolutely transform the palette as well. So if you look back to French examples, they're much more limited range of colors, whereas here you see all the different gradations of shades. And that allowed him to introduce into his work colors that might not naturally exist in the stones that he was using.
Incredible. I mean, they're just dazzling as well. But I mean, what was it that really set Carl Fabergé apart from his contemporaries?
Well, it's interesting. It really was the fact that he viewed Cartier and Boucheron as merchants. They were, there to sell really big rocks, really important rocks, whereas he was an artist jeweler, and he was not interested. I think Fabergé famously said, "If we're only valuing diamonds and pearls, there is no value to me." And what he did was create a world in which he gave brands within his own brand. So he had workmasters, the head workmasters, most famously Michael Perkin and Henrik Wikström. He allowed them to develop their own styles. And so when you compare the works of Fabergé to those of the other great jewelry houses, there's just that much more imagination. Yes, here's a great example. Here we have on the left a Fabergé clock and on the right a Cartier clock. And Cartier, the Cartier brothers very famously, just about after 1900 came. So we're so eager to steal the patronage of Fabergé. And in many ways, I think the ideas, they came to Russia to study what was happening in the little workshops. And Fabergé had a workshop for everything. It's extraordinary. Every aspect of work was either handled by an incredibly lapidary, an incredible goldsmith. Even the original boxes in which these objects were handmade by one master. So I think in looking at these two clocks, I know I'm passionate about Fabergé, but I don't think I'm going too far in saying the lapis example on the left, just the way that the stone that has been used, the thinness of the clock, extraordinary. And then on the right, you see Cartier trying to do a guilloché enamel, trying to use the same pattern and techniques as Fabergé, but it just, in my opinion, again, always comes up a bit flat, just not, somehow doesn't have the same spirit, can't capture the same whimsy that Fabergé did.
Totally. I mean, they're just mesmerizing. I mean, that's what they ultimately are. But I mean, Sotheby's has an upcoming sale of Russian works of art, Fabergé and icons on the 30th of November, which includes some extraordinary Fabergé pieces. I mean, could you share some examples with us, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So my auction on the 30th includes over 80 pieces by Fabergé, nearly 100 actually. And we have a beautiful selection of Fabergé jewels. So I think the first thing I'd love to show you is a pendant. These are actually two pendants in the sale. And this taps into what, again, Toby was saying about the evolution of Fabergé's style. So if we look at the pendant on the left, this has 3 different colors of sapphire set within really tiny rose-cut diamonds. But how modern, how incredibly chic. This is a jeweler who started very much studying things in kind of a mid-19th century lexicon, who then moves around 1910, again, through the hand of his specific workmasters, The Mosaic Egg, for example, was done by Alma Peel, who's his only female workmaster, who was completely modern in her designs, was really pushing deco before it even became as popular as it was in Paris many years later. You see that he's pushing these designs, using humble stones again, but making them incredibly colorful and brilliant. And on the right, we have, I love this pendant because it's an example of him transforming another object. So this is actually based on a kokoshnik, which would have been the headdress that ladies would wear to court balls. And he's emulating here, you can see in the gold work, that's emulating gilt threads. And they would be jewel set, gem set, and then have suspended pearls. So you can see from the pendant come these pearls that would have kind of framed a lady's face. And you can see we have a design for this, and it's magnificent, you know, considering what happened with the revolution, that we do have any excitant materials. But wonderfully, Fabergé designs do exist, and this is the design book of August Holmström. And here we can see the brilliance of Fabergé even adapting an idea. So if you look at the drawing, in the original drawing, the border is set with rose-cut diamonds, but yet in the pendant, which we have on the 30th of November, he has transformed it actually into guilloché enamel, the border. So adapting, just thinking, working with the materials. It may be that the diamonds, you know, just seem too busy, and he's made it just like, you know, imbued with a bit more elegance with the enamel. But it's that variety of techniques that I really love. Other objects that we have in the sale that exhibit these techniques are the flowers. So as I mentioned, I think it's the flowers that first took me by storm. And we're lucky enough to have what I consider one of the most extraordinary known examples of a Fabergé flower outside of the Royal Collection. And that is the apple blossom that you see towering over the other flowers in this image. And it's really extraordinary. The rock crystal pot is the size of my palm. I mean, the scale. And this actually has come to us with the provenance of, it was in Martha Baird Rockefeller, who was married to John D. Rockefeller. It was in her collection until 1971. And then it was acquired by Anna Inez Chiquita Astor. So it has this wonderful storied provenance. And it even has an imperial aspect. One of the fascinating things about Fabergé is you can sometimes look up the numbers that are scratched upon the object. And if you're very, very lucky, the extant ledger from Fabergé will exist, and you can look it up and find the provenance. So we have found that the apple blossom actually was a four-way purchase by the children of Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna for 800 rubles. This is, I mean, the average flower was somewhere between 250 to 350 rubles, which in today's money is, you know, we could probably buy an apartment for this amount of money. And here we have an example of the actual ledgers. So this document, which we were able to find in the archive, shows that each of the different children split it and paid £200 a piece to acquire this beautiful flower. Amazingly, I think we saw in that first slide, we actually have three examples of a flower, which, I mean, in my career, I've not had three of these kind of make their way to auction through different paths. You know, it's not a collection. Magically, they've kind of reunited with one another. And again, we've got a whole range of sizes. So we've got the violet, which was actually purchased at the London branch. So significantly, Fabergé opened up a London store, and that's the subject of the forthcoming exhibition. And then we have the pansy, which I love because it's a play on the French for Pansy, so think of me. And this one would have been gifted, I presume, I mean, very romantically, as a kind of keepsake, something that you could keep with you all the time. As Solange mentioned, you know, something that you could have just on your desk all the time to remind you of your loved ones. But no matter what the scale, and these two are very different scale, one quite large and one tiny, they both require the same amount of extraordinary craftsmanship. So if you look at the pansy, even that soil is made out of enamel. The terracotta vase is made out of enamel, which then is burnished to give it the feel of actual terracotta. And of course, the petals are all painted with beautiful enamel. They're just a wonder. And I think they really are, much like the surprises of the eggs, they were really intended just to bring joy. They're the greatest toys that I think you could ever acquire. And they were also very famously given when a big jewel wasn't appropriate. When it wasn't appropriate to give a diamond necklace or a pearl necklace, they were given to the members of the imperial family mainly. So the biggest collectors were Maria Feodorovna, Alexandra Feodorovna, and Queen Alexandra of the United Kingdom. And they were given these things by people who wanted to win favor. They're just the ultimate present.
I love the idea of they're these kind of toys, but I mean, they're just breathtaking. And now is an excellent time to bring in Solange. I mean, I would love to talk to you about your jewellery. I mean, tell us about your practice and the inspiration that you've drawn from Fabergé.
Well, I mean, I do think that jewels for women are actually a grown-up version of toys. And a lot of my jewellery is quite playful. It spins or shakes or morphs into something else. And I think when I came up with Metamorphosis, I wanted to create object in the grand tradition of jewelry making that then became jewelry. I nearly called this collection Solly Pocket because it's like those little worlds that you can lose yourself in and play with, and they transform into jewelry. I mean, historically, jewelry was adaptable, so you could have a tiara that turned into a necklace, or earrings that became brooches, and it doesn't really happen anymore, which I think is a shame in jewelry. And so this is what the Metamorphosis was, and I wanted to take the playful nature of my jewelry a step further. I mean, often in the same way, what I loved, what Helen said about how Fabergé didn't see himself as a merchant selling big rocks. I mean, I've never sold big rocks, and I much prefer playing with the artistry of the craft that is available in this wonderful business of jewelry. And a lot of them are lost, like enameling is such a tough one to achieve. And creating Metamorphosis really was not for the commerce of it, because it was a very long, painstaking, laborious process to create each piece. Because there are 10s and 20 different moving parts in each object, and each object requires the time it required to make and create. It took a long time to get this collection together. So the Secret Garden was a jardin d'hiver, a little conservatory that sits on a beautiful lotus flower. And when you reveal what's inside, is you have these a little bench, the sandals that someone has kicked off as she takes shelter from the rain, and they can all be worn as pendants, as can the floor. It can be removed and turned into a necklace, and the walls of the conservatory become a pair of cuffs. They're made of plique-à-jour enamel, and I suppose the shape of the conservatory definitely was informed by the way we thought we could dismantle it and make it wearable. So that's why it became this kind of round floral shape.
And what about the Ark of the Covenant collection?
And the Ark of the Covenant, again, I suppose I've always kind of loved that the mystery of that story, the way it's been lost in time, the Ark of the Covenant containing the 10 Commandments, and it's sitting on a cloud in heaven somewhere. And as you open the box, the angels and the birds guarding it can be taken off and turned into a pendant. And the bejeweled box containing the Ten Commandments turns into a cross, a bejeweled cross, which is quite Russian in a funny way. And I suppose it marries the Judeo-Christian traditions and links them both together.
Amazing. I mean, they're just so intricate. But I mean, Helen, what parallels do you see between Solange and Fabergé's work?
Well, I think Solange is such an incredible conceptual thinker. And I think that's the exact same process that Fabergé was going through, was having these ideas, these completely unique ideas, these completely fun, meant to delight and to imbue beautiful objects with just joy. So I can see in her work, she has an idea, and then it's really thinking about and knowing materials and understanding how to make that in 3 dimensions. We talk about artists all the time. Amazing. The history of painting is wonderful, but there are a lot more challenges when you're working in 3 dimensions and when you're not just working with paint and canvas. So I adore the way that Solange also uses enamel to imbue her works with different color. She also uses hard stones. Again, much like Fabergé, it's just the creativity with which she's using natural materials. So here in the Secret Garden, it just reminds me so much of the surprises inside a Fabergé egg, just what you can reveal and how you can play with it. It's funny, in this design, you even have a bay tree, and there was a Fabergé egg that was based on a bay tree. So they're just, whether they're conscious or not, I think they're just like a lot of these cross ideas, and maybe that's just what happens when you're truly an artist expressing themselves through a jeweler's material, which I think both Solange and Fabergé were and are.
Absolutely. But I mean, Solange, how do you play with functionality versus the art objects on your work? You don't have to wear something to appreciate it, do you?
No, absolutely. I also created a collection called Unwearable Jewels. So they were bejeweled objects for the home, mainly wall plaques, actually. So creating a plaque to hang on your wall and to enjoy, using hard stones. Again, these so-called humble materials, but they're equally beautiful to diamonds, rubies, emeralds, whatever. They have their place, and they have these incredible intense colors that you can't reproduce using precious stones. So we have lapis, turquoise, rock crystal, amethyst, malachite. In fact, there are rubies in there also, and diamond raindrops, mother of pearl clouds. And they give such pleasure, and so beautifully made. And it's another way of, yes, exploring the jeweler's art. That's what I really want to do. I have these concepts and these ideas, and I like to marry them with a way of making that perhaps is not very au courant, very current, and it's really nice to see if we can achieve it. So they sometimes take a bit longer than we'd like, and sometimes I think, who on earth is going to buy these things? But it doesn't matter. It's a means of, I have these things I like to say, stories I want to tell, and this is how I like to do it. And there are people who do appreciate it ultimately, but obviously they're not the most accessible things.
No, but they're just remarkable in the way that they just glimmer, and how amazing to see your work in also another dimension as well.
Yeah, absolutely, because I've made these wall plaques as rings. In fact, they started as rings, and then they were kind of blown up. There are a lot of artists like that. A lot of artists take a mundane or a small object and then blow it up. If you think of Damien Hirst's, his anatomical body has just blown up into a giant degree. It's either make things big or make things small. And it's quite interesting seeing things in different dimensions, that's for sure.
Absolutely. Toby, I'd love to bring you back in at this point to help us also understand the journey of the Fabergé eggs from being rather ostentatious gifts and displays of wealth within the imperial family to becoming among the most sought after and luxurious collectibles in the world today. How have many of these eggs left Russia and found their way into the world's best museums and collections?
Well, it was definitely a journey, which I suppose starts with the revolution. With the Empress Alexandra Feodorovna being put under house arrest, along with her husband Nicholas. Marie Feodorovna, Nicholas's mother, fleeing down out to the south of Russia, south of the Ukraine, really, the Crimean Peninsula, from which she was eventually rescued. That all leads to chaos. And you have these 50 eggs, 30 given to Marie Feodorovna, 20 given to Alexandra, which disappeared for a while, not surprisingly, in the chaos of the revolution. Then, as things settle down, as I suppose you could say, Lenin takes control, he decides it's time to start examining some of what he's got. And some of what he's got, of course, is in the storerooms of the Kremlin, the Armory Museum in the Kremlin. And in the early 1920s, teams of catalogers start going through what's in crates in the basement of the Kremlin. And what they discover, sent there from the Hermitage towards the end of the First World War, as the German troops were approaching St. Petersburg, or Petrograd as it then was, they sent stuff further east to get away from the Germans, huge quantities of treasure. Treasure that includes the Russian crown jewels, and also includes a number of eggs. And I just love this picture we're showing here. It's a picture, I think, taken in the early 1920s, when a Parisian jewelry company was coming to visit Moscow to see what was for sale. And this is a sign of what was to come, of course. They were starting to think about selling stuff. And so they put a little display out. And it's just a little display of some of the most fabulous things you're ever likely to see. Obviously, you can see the huge imperial crowns and things there. But if you look closely at this picture, you can also see 13, at least 13, and there may be more, 13 of the Imperial Fabergé eggs. And so that's what had been found in the basement of the Kremlin. Of those 50, something over 40 were found there. All the ones given to Alexandra Feodorovna, they'd been secured immediately after her arrest, really, the abdication of her husband. Marie Feodorovna's, of course, slightly more confused situation, something over 20 of hers, but not all of the 30 she'd been given. And so they then stayed there in the Kremlin for a while. They didn't sell them to that Parisian jewelry firm, but it was really Lenin's successor, Stalin, who did start the program of sales. There were these raids, really, on the Armory Museum over the course of the late 1920s and early 1930s, by the end of which the Kremlin was only left with 10 of the original Fabergé eggs, and all the rest had been sold overseas. Not for huge sums, it's fair to say, because by then Fabergé was deeply unfashionable. He was associated with the discredited Russian royal family. Certainly in Russia, he wasn't thought much of, but even outside Russia, he wasn't thought that much of, really. They were seen as these sort of, well, they were out of fashion. And you can see that in the prices and things like that wonderful, gorgeous, simple, white enameled hen egg that I showed you right at the beginning, was auctioned in the early 1930s here in London for only, I think, £85 it fetched, which is just a mind-boggling sum when you think about it. I mean, of course, the value of the pound has declined since then. Nevertheless, £85 even then wasn't a huge sum. And you really see them only gradually coming back into fashion over the course of the 1940s and 1950s, fueled largely by American buyers. And indeed, a lot of the best eggs are now in American museums, although Her Majesty the Queen does own 3, bought by King George and Queen Mary. And in the end, the person who really sort of ends up bringing Fabergé back into fashion, I wouldn't say single-handedly, but certainly he's the one who really drives up the prices, is Malcolm Forbes, the magazine magnate, who I find an immensely attractive character, really. I mean, one of the great quotes attributed to him is, "He who dies with the most toys wins." And he certainly liked collecting his toys, and I think that's what he saw in the Fabergé. We've heard about Solange's jewellery and indeed the surprises being toys. In the end, that is what the Fabergé eggs are. They are beautiful objects and also very, very upmarket toys. You see him on the left there, holding, I think, his favourite among all the Fabergé eggs he acquired. And then you see his sons on the right posing behind all the Fabergé eggs he ended up acquiring. And sometime in the course of the 1960s or early 70s, Malcolm Forbes decided that he was in, as he put it, an egg race with the Kremlin. The Kremlin, of course, had its 10 eggs. Malcolm Forbes decided he was going to try and end up with more. And you can see, if you can count the number of eggs on the table there in front of the sons, see there are 12. Apparently, after he'd bought the 11th of his eggs and thereby beaten the Kremlin, Malcolm Forbes was asked if he was going to stop. And he said, well, eggs usually come in dozens. And the truth is he was already in negotiations to buy the 12th of those eggs. And it is a magnificent collection, actually. But at the time when he was building it, it seemed like folly, really. He would boast about the prices he was paying. He would say, every time we buy an egg, we break a record in the purchase price we pay, and the record we've broken is the one we set the last time we bought an egg. He's driving prices to a level that nobody else can understand. And this folly's all of a sudden comes right. Well, it has become clearly right by the time he dies, of course, but we really see how right it's become when his family sell that collection in the early 2000s to a Russian oligarch. It was going to be auctioned at Sotheby's, but the oligarch preempted that auction and bought it all in one job lot, Victor Vekselberg. And I think these days he admits to paying at least $120 million for it. So an absolutely vast sum, entirely justifying Malcolm Forbes's investment in it. Even though of those 12, it actually turns out not all are Fabergé Imperial Easter eggs, because we now, since Perestroika, have access to Fabergé's invoices, clearly describing the eggs from every year. It turns out that of those 12, in fact, only, I'm sort of saying only in inverted commas, only 9 are actually Imperial Easter eggs. The other 3 have different sort of provenances. So he hadn't actually beaten the Kremlin in his egg race at all. Nevertheless, it turned out to be a very good investment indeed. And I love the way that purchase by a Russian oligarch really brings the story full circle, because it means these eggs are now back being owned by, I suppose you could call, the modern equivalent of the Tsars who commissioned them back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
How fantastic. And so, Helen, what does the current market for Fabergé eggs and art objects look like today?
Well, I love the story that Toby's just said. And I remember the press release at the time from Sotheby's was that it was the most romantic end to the story in a way, that these eggs had come full circle. But the market is quite different from just eggs. I mean, eggs are exceptionally rare and therefore have a kind of value of their own. What I see more often and what really creates the market for Fabergé is just the full range of what the jeweler created. He was making really humble, functional items into works of art, as well as really high art objects such as the flowers we've seen. And how does the market respond? Well, the market has kind of been challenged by what we would call Fabergé. So a lot of what I do is actually getting to the bottom of whether or not something's right, because as with most things, if even in his own time, Fabergé was being copied. So if you do something incredible, you create jealousy, and copies very quickly are spurned. And here in my sale, we actually have these objects which have beautiful, unbroken provenance. And that is so important to the market because there have been these very sophisticated fakes that, as a market grows, have proliferated. It becomes, collectors are very savvy these days, and there's a core Russian buying base that knows exactly what they want, exactly what they're looking at. But then there's also an international appeal for many of the reasons that Toby was pointing out, the way that these objects have traveled. So in my forthcoming sale, we have a beautiful cigarette case, a enameled egg pendant. So that's as close as I usually get to the large scale eggs, is miniature egg pendants, which would have been gifted. And this one, I don't know whether you can see on the side, there's a little button and it actually springs open as a locket. I mean, so just beautiful mechanized objects. And these objects you can see are on a beautifully emblazoned Cartier box. And why is that? And that is, to what Toby was saying, the journey. So these objects were actually part of the lost inheritance of the Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, who gathered together her items following 1917 and had to flee. And you can imagine, you could, as the imperial family fled, some more successfully than others, they had to take what they could. So we have this beautiful cigarette case, the egg pendant, and then we have jewels on the side, which were just sold in our Geneva sale, which were also belong to her, but have all come from the same provenance. So these incredibly personal items, but then that have this wonderful story behind them. They were acquired by the present owners directly from her descendants. So that type of thing, the market responds very well to. I think the market is strong. We had our Brooklyn sale of 15 objects from Fabergé, which was valued at 1.3 million and actually made 3.3 million. Because when something's rare, collectors really, really come out in force. And in that sale, 36% of the buying was from new buyers. So I think there's a real ability to understand and appreciate Fabergé and get kind of hooked. And that can start with the most humble items. So my sale also includes some objects which are very much functional objects that you would have on your desk, adorning your house, that Fabergé takes in much in the same way as we were discussing Solange's work, take something that you would have in your environment and transforms it into an art object. So think of the joy of a nephrite and gold, a gold-mounted magnifying glass. As a Fabergé art expert, this would be my ultimate object. Can you imagine expecting the Fabergé with your Fabergé? But this is beautifully crafted. You can see how the hand would hold the nephrite in such a thoughtful way. And then we have a bookmark, which, just picking up on the egg again, another version of it has a guilloche enameled egg on top of it. And here you can really see what I was mentioning before about the luminosity of Fabergé's enamel technique. In order to get this shade of pink, this isn't just one layer of enamel. This is pink layered on yellow, layered on pink, layered on yellow, and Fabergé would build this up. And the difficulty in that is you have to fire it every single time at different temperatures. And again, on this bookmark, you can see it has a white enamel border, which actually would have to be fired at the highest level. So really at the very end, it all could go wrong and explode in the kiln. So it's not just a simple object for placing, marking your page in your book. It is an ultimate expression of luxury. So those are the objects that I think are hard to find. They're amazing when they do come up because the real ones aren't being made anymore. So it's always a treasure hunt.
I love all the different iterations of eggs and just the breadth of his practice as well. It's just incredible. But as a last question, I would just love to hear from all of our speakers on what you are working on next and what they are looking forward to. Let's kick off with you, Solange.
Well, in fact, I'm about to release a new collection, which I conceived during lockdown. And lockdown made everything seem incredibly volatile and chaotic and unsafe. And so I just started thinking about, from a jewelry perspective, what would make you feel a bit more grounded and solid and reliable, and gold came to mind. Just a whole collection devoted to gold. And then I started riffing on the concept of gold and the golden goose and the golden egg. And of course, working from home and being at my desk, surrounded by my objects, what would be lovely would be a beautiful gold paperweight. And the golden egg became a paperweight, and the cracked surface is a way of keeping the egg from rolling around. So when it's on your desk, you see the pure form of the egg, but then when you hold it, the crackles appear. So that's one of my extravagant objets that came out of this.
Gosh, I love the sort of juxtaposition between the vulnerability of the cracks and the solidness of the gold. It's absolutely beautiful. But what about you, Helen?
In the short term, I'm very much looking forward to the V&A exhibition, which opens on the 20th. So I think that's this week. So I think Toby mentioned the original V&A exhibition, and at that time, there were queues around the block. And so I'm very excited to see what is in many ways an overdue tribute to Fabergé and the role he played in London. And then I'm also, of course, looking forward to my sale on the 30th of November, just to see, well, it's wonderful because when we have our sale, collectors come into town. I think people are coming for the V&A. I can't wait to discuss the things I love with the people who really appreciate them the most. And then longer term, it's always on to the next. So I'm already in the process of trying to find more.
Well, what a moment for Fabergé. I'm so excited for the V&A exhibition. Toby, what's next for you?
Well, since writing my book about Fabergé, I've carried on writing books. I produced 2 in 2019. One was a history of the family firm, Faber and Faber, which I always feel I need to add at this point is the only one of my books that is published by Faber and Faber. But the other book I produced then was a thriller called Close to the Edge. And so what I'm doing at the moment is I'm trying to write a sequel to that thriller. I always think perhaps I should include Fabergé eggs in my thrillers, really, because they are the immediate shorthand, aren't they, for luxuriance and opulence and something immensely stealable. So I need to think about that a bit.
Oh my goodness, it will just be riveting. You should absolutely do that. Well, my thanks to Solange Azagury-Partridge, Helen Culver-Smith and Toby Faber for their brilliant contributions to today's event, and to Sotheby's and Intelligence Squared for putting it all together. Sotheby's forthcoming sale of Russian works of art, Fabergé and icons will be held as a live auction in London on 30th of November 2021 and will be open to the public for viewing from the 26th of November. I hope you enjoyed watching. Thank you to everyone for joining us.